Hello and welcome to this edition of Arirang News Special for Thursday, March 16th. I'm Min San-hee. Today we cover live the summit between President Yoon Suk-yeol and Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida over in Tokyo, which marks the first such visit by a South Korean leader to neighboring Japan in 12 years, solely for the purpose of a bilateral summit. Now, earlier in 2019, South Korea took part, that is, in the G20 summit in Osaka, but there was no bilateral interaction between the two leaders of the two countries back then. Today, we are carrying live scenes from Tokyo as Seoul's visiting delegation, led by President Yoon Suk-yeol, arrives at the venue of the bilateral summit. Now, today's agenda begins with the extended talks between the two countries. And while we wait for that, I have here in the studio Professor Min Jung-hoon from the Korea National Diplomatic Academy. Professor Min, it's been a while. Welcome back.
Yeah. Thanks for having me today.
I also have our foreign correspondent, Choi Min-jung, in the studio with us. Min-jung, welcome.
Pleasure to be here.
Right, Professor Min, perhaps we can start with you. As I mentioned earlier, this is the first time in like a dozen years that a South Korean leader has traveled to neighboring Japan solely for the purpose of a bilateral summit. What are the implications of this advancement, if I may, in bilateral ties?
Yes, basically, I got the impression that Japan is a very important neighbor, but the geopolitically it's a little bit distant and long, but geographically it's very close from the South Korea. And as you mentioned, it has been about 12 years since the two leaders of the two countries, South Korea and Japan, have got the kind of the bilateral meeting. It shows that the two countries have got a little bit difficult situations in terms of the relations of the two countries. But this time, the President Yoon made the tough decision, difficult decision about resolving the historical disputes, specifically the wartime first labor issue, and then we can see there's some kind of improvement of the relations between the two countries. And the bilateral summit meeting is the starting point, revitalize the relations between the two countries. It's like a historical moment.
Right, it is. Min Jung, not much has been officially shared about the agenda for the summit today, but what do we know as of now?
Well, the prime focus of this bilateral meeting is to normalize ties on all possible fronts. And this involves solving the issue of compensating Korean victims of Japan's wartime forced labor. Yoon's visit to Japan was announced just 3 days after the South Korean government unveiled its plan to compensate victims through a domestic foundation last week. So it is very widely expected that the two leaders will address this issue. What's also on the agenda is economic cooperation. South Korea's trade ministry just a few moments ago said Japan lifted export curbs on chip materials to South Korea, and in return, South Korea withdrew WTO complaints on Japan's export curbs. The two sides have previously decided to hold official talks over the lifting of Japan's curbs on exports to Korea, which have been in place since 2019. And back then, it also removed Seoul from its so-called white list of countries that receive preferential trade treatment. The general sentiment is that Japan's export curb imposed on South Korea should be lifted in order to mend sour relations. And talks over South Korea's return to Japan's white list may also be on the agenda as well. The two leaders are likely to tap into security issues as well, as South Korea and Japan's information sharing agreement, known as GSOMIA, is expected to be normalized as well. Trilateral cooperation between South Korea, Japan, and the U.S. is also one of the key issues that could be addressed, and this also comes amid growing provocations from North Korea.
Right, and all that being said, Professor Min, what are your prospects regarding today's summit between the two leaders? I mean, do you believe some meaningful ground will be covered, or will this summit just simply serve to be yet another symbolic event?
Well, basically, as I mentioned earlier today, it's a history moment to revitalize the relations between the two countries. And it's important to revitalize the relations at the top level, top leaders level. And the President Yoon made a difficult decision to revitalize the relations of the two countries. So it will be kind of the restarting point of the shuttle diplomacy. And the two leaders will mainly discuss the two top agendas, as the reporter mentioned, like the security and the economic issues. So today we'll see the kind of the starting moment to carefully and significantly, seriously talk about how the two countries will make the cooperation for the coping with the threat of North Korea, mainly the nuclear and missile threats, because the two countries are under the influence of the North Korea's provocations. And meanwhile, South Korea and Japan are the very important in the economic partners. And mainly in terms of the strategic competition between U.S. and China, the role, including the two countries, have witnessed that the U.S. is forcing China to exclude from the global supply chain, mainly in terms of the high-tech, the technology and strategic industries. So it's very important to make a cooperation between the two countries, South Korea and Japan, and in terms of the working together. Together in terms of the taking the important positions when the U.S. is the reshaping the global supply chain. And so in that aspect, it's very important for South Korea to make the consistent the cooperation with Japan, because South Korea, Japan are very important regional allies of the United States.
Right, they really are very important partners. And that being said, Professor Min, as we look ahead to this latest high-level interaction between the two neighbors, what response do you expect from Tokyo with regard to efforts by the Yoon administration to come up with a solution to the issue of compensation for Korean victims of Japan's wartime forced labor?
Well, unfortunately, in my opinion, it's my personal opinion, but the Japanese government will maintain the very careful position about that kind of the sensitive issue. It's mainly because of the Japan's domestic politics. So the Kishida government got some kind of influence from the conservative groups in Japan. So it's very careful in terms of making the comments and opinions or the official statement about how actively the Japanese government will respond to the South Korean government decision about the issue. So personally, I think that the Prime Minister Kishida will just maintain the official statement that it will just maintain, or it will just hand down the previous Japanese government's the position about the issue. Just the consistency or the continuity, that should be it, I think. But personally, I hope that if the Prime Minister Kishida will be more active in terms of the receiving or taking the South Korea's the wish or the opinion or attitude, then and just to try to embrace the victims the wish or the opinion, then the two countries the relations will be more bright. But we will see.
Right, we will see. And while you were speaking, Professor Min, I've just been informed that Seoul's delegation, led by President Yoon Suk-yeol, that is, has arrived at the venue of the talks. And staying with the issue of compensation, Min Jung, what has been shared about the response, the actual response from the victims of the forced labor?
Right, the resolution has immediately provoked a fierce backlash from the victims, the families, and the civic groups, and they have been protesting against the government's plan, saying this issue cannot be resolved without a sincere apology and participation from the Japanese companies responsible. Now, civic groups took to the streets in front of the National Assembly, calling the plan a national humiliation, and two forced labor victims also spoke up against the plan, insisting that they never seen anything like this happen and that all they want is a sincere apology. On Monday, 3 surviving victims of Japan's wartime forced labor officially expressed their intention to reject the South Korean government's compensation plan. They delivered a document stating their objections, and the victims' legal representative said the move is aimed at leaving clear evidence that the victims have expressed their opposition in case of legal disputes in the future. So the victims remain very firm in their stance and seem like they are ready to fight for what they want, which is a true apology and participation from Japanese Japanese companies. And with disputes already beginning, the Foreign Ministry says that they will continue to communicate closely with the victims on the matter. And meanwhile, South Korea's biggest steelmaker, POSCO, has become the first company to make contributions to the fund that will be used to compensate the victims of forced labor. On Wednesday, the company announced that it donated 4 billion won, or around $3 million to the domestic foundation, funded by Korean companies that were established partially using Japanese funds under the 1965 Normalization Treaty. Now, POSCO is one of those companies, and back in 2012, they vowed to donate a total of 10 billion won, and it had already donated 3 million won each in both 2016 and 2017. So with the latest payment, POSCO said it had now fulfilled its promise.
Right, and staying with that, Professor, I mean, this is an impromptu question. Do you see Nippon Steel and Mitsubishi Heavy Industries perhaps taking their own voluntary action to perhaps contribute to this fund set up by the unit administration to compensate the victims?
Well, I'm not sure. Frankly speaking, I'm not sure at this point because it's a very sensitive issue, and it is related to the political distractions of the Japanese government and the political groups in Japan. So the Nippon Steel and the Mitsubishi companies are very careful in terms of making any official statements about the issue. So it will wait what kind of the results this upcoming summit will have, and if there is any kind of the opinion change in terms of Japanese governments about the issue. But as I mentioned earlier, to date, it will not be easy for Japanese government to change.
Right, it will be a very tough task, of course.
So that as the Min Jung mentioned, the key points of the issue is whether Japanese governments and the Japanese companies will make a true apologies to the victims.
To the victims, of course.
And the active participation.
Professor Min, I'll have to interrupt you for a second. I've just been told that President Yoon Suk-yeol has entered the venue, and the extended talks will begin shortly. We will now cut live to the scenes you're seeing on the screen, and we'll come back to you afterwards. Right. Right, we are actually carrying live scenes from Tokyo as President Yoon Suk-yeol personally says hello to the Japanese delegation. Right, Professor Min, what are your thoughts with regard to this very remarkable scenes, of course, coming in some 12 years since we've had the South Korean president traveling to Japan solely for the purpose of a bilateral summit, right?
You're right, and we saw the Japanese honor guard inspection on the President Yoon and our delegates, and this time the presidential visit is kind of the working visit, but the Japanese government has got the higher levels of the ceremonial the events, including the honor guard inspection. So it's comparable to the kind of the state visit. So it means that the Japanese government has got a lot of importance of the summit. So it's a very historical moment to revitalize the two-country relations. And I can also see the two leaders, the facial, the expressions, they are very peaceful and calm and very friendly. So which symbolize the two leaders, the relationship would be the good and would be the better, and it would be the favorable to the improve the kind of the confidence building between the leaders, and the personal trust between two leaders is very important for the diplomatic situations.
Right. Hopefully their expressions are indication of some potential very positive developments on the diplomatic front, which ultimately will lead to very positive advancements on the economic front as well. Professor Mindo, beyond history, pundits say security concerns are what have actually pushed Seoul and Tokyo to mend their ties. And that being said, I understand efforts are underway to set up a fresh, faster three-way information sharing system, similar to the GSOMIA, but in a three-way format and not in a two-way exchange. What are your thoughts?
Well, that's what the U.S. government really wants, in terms of improving the security situations around the Korean Peninsula. And you mentioned the through-way information sharing, the pact toward agreement. It is called the TISA, the Trilateral Information Sharing Agreement. And it's a very important pact agreement that the three countries has mobilized to share the information, mainly in terms of the North Korea's provocations. As you mentioned, the South Korea and Japan are very important regional partners against the North Korea provocations and protecting the securities of the countries. And so Japan and South Korea and Japan are very important regional allies of the United States. And as you know, the 28,500 U.S. military stationed in the Korean Peninsula. So the U.S. also got some of the national interests on the Korean Peninsula. So the improving the security situations among three countries, South Korea, U.S., and Japan, are very important. But unfortunately, in terms of the historical disputes of the two countries, South Korea and Japan, U.S. got very difficult situations in terms of improving or enhancing the security, the cooperation among the three countries. So U.S. really welcomes the summit, and it really expected that the three-way security cooperation among the three countries will be better in the coming days and months.
Right, hopefully. And staying with security as well as Pyongyang's provocations, which Professor Min has just mentioned, what are the prospects, Min Jung, of a nuclear test by the regime in the near future, as seen by Seoul's foreign ministry?
Right. North Korea has really stepped up its weapons test in the past couple of days. And even today, on the day of the Seoul-Tokyo summit, South Korea's military said North Korea fired an ICBM toward the East Sea. Also, Seoul and Washington have conducted joint military drills since Monday. And in retaliation, Pyongyang test launched 2 medium-range ground-to-ground ballistic missiles on Tuesday, and this came just 2 days after the regime fired 2 submarine-launched missiles on Sunday. So there is obviously discontent over the military drills as well as the summit, which is being fully displayed. And following Pyongyang's recent provocations, top nuclear envoys from South Korea, Japan, and the U.S. strongly condemned North Korea, saying the launches are a clear violation of a number of UN Security Council resolutions and are raising tensions in the region. And earlier in the week, Japan's chief cabinet secretary said that Tokyo will continue to maintain close cooperation with Seoul and Washington as it prepares for further provocations by North Korea. And South Korea's intelligence agency has previously said North Korea is likely to test fire its new ICBM and hold a major military exercise in March or April alongside Seoul-Washington military drills and a summit planned for next month.
Right, a summit between U.S. President Joe Biden and South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol, of course. And speaking about President Joe Biden, Professor Min, he was very quick to praise the latest campaign of rapprochement initiated by his South Korean counterpart. Is this response, do you suppose, only natural given the current climate of geopolitical uncertainties?
Basically, it clearly shows how important it is for the two countries, South Korea and Japan, to maintain good relations with each other. And it also shows how the eager the U.S. government want to see the better situations in terms of the two key allies, their relations. And as you know, in terms of historical disputes, the two allies got the difficult situations in terms of making cooperations. So that's one of the big concerns that U.S. government has got for the past years. And we can see the little bit better situations in terms of improving the two countries' situation. So there's no doubt that Joe Biden really welcomes and quickly responded to that kind of event.
Right. Min-jung, let's now turn to the economy. Earlier, Professor Min pointed out that the economic ties between the two neighbors are of much importance, of course. And that being said, you also mentioned this earlier. I understand both Seoul and Tokyo have agreed to settle their economic differences outside of the WTO. Tell us more.
Right. Well, relations between South Korea and Japan have really worsened in 2019 when Japan slapped restrictions in apparent retaliation for the South Korean Supreme Court's ruling on the forced labor issue the year before. Back in 2018, South Korea's Supreme Court ordered 2 Japanese companies, Mitsubishi Heavy Industries and Nippon Steel, to compensate the Koreans they subjected to forced labor. But those firms refused to comply, and Tokyo has been insisting that the issue of compensation was settled under a normalization treaty signed in 1965. So in retaliation for the court's ruling, Tokyo imposed export controls on 3 major industrial materials that are necessary for South Korea's production of chips and displays. And as I mentioned before, Japan also removed Seoul from its so-called white list of preferred trading partners. And in response, South Korea filed a complaint with the WTO over the trade dispute, claiming it was a discriminatory act that goes against its rules. But as I mentioned earlier, the South Korean government has decided to withdraw the WTO dispute settlement procedures as Japan lifted its export restrictions as well.
Right, and staying with that move, Professor Min, pundits say the chances of Tokyo placing Seoul back on its white list of preferred trading partners are quite high. Do you share this optimism?
Yes, I'm quite optimistic about that. But so far, we need to have a little more time before we can see that kind of decision. But meanwhile, it's very good to hear that Japan just removed the kind of the export control against South Korea, and so it'll take a little bit time. Because it's kind of the administrational procedures and the technical procedures before Japan just put the South Korea back to the white list of the favorite of the trade partners. I think it's just a matter of time.
Right, it really is. Let's now take a look at this following report by our senior presidential correspondent Oh Soo-young before she traveled to Japan, of course, with regard to prospects of the summit between President Yoon Suk-yeol and Prime Minister Fumio Kishida. Do take a look.
Rather than setting a statement in stone, the leaders of South Korea and Japan will work on building a solid foundation to improve bilateral ties through economic and diplomatic exchanges. A presidential official told reporters Wednesday that President Yoon Suk-yeol and Prime Minister Fumio Kishida will hold a press conference after their talks and share the results of their discussion in turn, but there will not be a joint statement. The official said the summit is significant in restoring bilateral ties, which hit a critical low after 2018, but the milestone is yet a stepping stone in building future-oriented relations. While addressing their differences over history, which are domestically sensitive issues for both Yoon and Kishida, and which triggered a trade dispute in 2019, the two leaders will focus on advancing areas they agree on. This will include restoring a ministerial-level platform on economic issues, including finance, trade and science and technology, as the two leaders discuss ending Japan's restrictions on exports of chip materials to South Korea. Given South Korea's reliance on global trade for economic growth, Seoul's Senior Presidential Secretary for Economic Affairs said Tokyo is an obvious and inevitable partner in economic cooperation to strengthen supply chains, expand South Korea's export industries, and nurture new tech sectors.
We can lead the way in new future technologies if we can maximize our synergy in R&D by combining South Korea's strength in chips, displays, and other strategic technologies with Japan's strength in basic science.
In resetting economic ties, the president will attend a roundtable of key business figures on Friday, with the chiefs of Samsung, SK, LG, Hyundai and Lotte groups joining the session, as well as representatives of small and medium firms. Yoon will also meet with members of bilateral friendship groups and deliver a lecture to Korean and Japanese university students. As the momentum for rapprochement grows, Kyodo News has reported that Kishida is mulling a visit to South Korea after he hosts the G7 meeting in May. He is likely to invite Yoon to join the summit in Hiroshima. Oh Soo-young, Arirang News.
Right, and in related news, efforts to mend bilateral ties are also breeding fresh optimism into prospects of more active cultural exchanges between South Korea and Japan. My colleague Song Yoo-jin reports.
Ahead of the planned summit between South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol and Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida, all eyes are on whether this can be a turning point for the soured Seoul-Tokyo relations. That includes cultural ties as well. Cultural diplomacy between the two countries kicked off in 1998 after former President Kim Dae-jung and his Japanese counterpart Keizo Obuchi came up with what was called a New Japan Republic of Korea partnership towards the 21st century.
The first Korean wave in Japan started in the early 2000s after the hit Korean drama Winter Sonata aired in Japan. Then in 2010, K-pop rose to the fame thanks to the artists like Kara, TVXQ, and Girls' Generation.
But ties weakened as relations turned thorny from the early 2010s over historical and territorial disputes. This triggered the anti-Korea and no-Japan boycott movements in each country. But the good news is that things have gotten better.
During COVID-19, both Koreans and Japanese people started consuming more of each other's content through streaming platforms.
The fourth Korean wave in Japan is happening right now, where interest not only lies in K-content, but food, products, tourism, and language. The younger generations are leading the wave, whereas during the early 2000s, it was the older generations.
And experts predict President Yoon and Prime Minister Kishida's meeting will further boost cultural exchanges.
Cultural, interpersonal exchanges depend greatly on bilateral ties. When relations were not good, it was hard for people in Japan to publicly show their interest towards Korean culture. The bilateral summit could help break this atmosphere.
The same goes for tourism. Strained ties in COVID-19 cut cross-border interaction between Seoul and Tokyo. But it's been recovering since the second half of last year following the easing of virus protocols such as the resumption of visa-free entry between two countries.
School trips and group tours from companies are heavily influenced by diplomatic relations. We're already seeing more school trips from Japan this month. We expect more of these tours to take place after Thursday's summit.
All that's left now is for Seoul-Tokyo cultural and tourism exchanges to get back on track. Song Yoo-jin, Arirang News.
Meanwhile, here on the Korean Peninsula, as my colleague Choi Min-jung mentioned earlier, North Korea is believed to have launched an intercontinental ballistic missile earlier on this Thursday, hours ahead of the scheduled summit between South Korea and Japan. Our defense correspondent Kim Hyun-sung has details.
North Korea's fourth show of force in a week. North Korea fired another ballistic missile off to the East Sea, and this time it was a long-range missile, South Korea's Joint Chiefs of Staff confirmed on Thursday morning. It was fired at a high angle and flew about 1,000 kilometers east. Japan's defense ministry said that the missile traveled for about 69 minutes and reached a maximum altitude of 6,000 kilometers. It added that the missile landed around 250 kilometers west of Hokkaido Prefecture's Oshima Island. Analysts gathered from the flight data that this could be an intercontinental ballistic missile, likely the Hwasong-17. The Hwasong-17 is North Korea's largest nuclear-capable missile to date. It's also the world's biggest liquid-fueled ICBM that can be moved on roads. Last year, Japanese Defense Minister Yasukazu Hamada mentioned that this weapon has the capability to reach the U.S. mainland with a potential range of 15,000 kilometers. But South Korea's military officials said that although this launch does bear some similarities to the Hwasong-17, they also did find some differences that could suggest otherwise, although these details cannot be disclosed at the moment. If this test did involve an ICBM, this would mark North Korea's seventh successful ICBM test since 2017. North Korea's latest weapons test comes on the day of South Korea and Japan's bilateral summit and before President Yoon Suk-yeol embarked on his two-day visit to Tokyo. Their timing hints that North Korea is disgruntled by the rekindled relationship between Seoul and Tokyo.
This is to prevent and rally against the strengthened trilateral alliance between South Korea, the US, and Japan. They think that this could pose a greater threat to their regime.
There is also the Freedom Shield, the largest Seoul-Washington war games in years. That's now into its fourth day. And North Korea is also holding its own annual training at the moment, all taking part alongside North Korea's lively firearms show and tell. The National Security Council on Thursday morning responded to North Korea's recent threats. National Security Advisor Kim Sung-han held an emergency standing committee with key players, including President Yoon Suk-yeol before his flight. The standing committee members stressed that this latest launch is a clear violation of UN security resolutions and a threat to peace. Kim Hyun-sung, Arirang.News.
Right, indeed. For those of you just tuning in, Arirang TV is carrying live the summit by President Yoon Suk-yeol and his Japanese counterpart Fumio Kishida over in Tokyo on this Thursday. And while we wait for live scenes from the venue there, I have Professor Min in the studio with me for talks. Professor, what economic gains do the two countries, South Korea and Japan, look to secure from stronger bilateral ties, which was something you touched upon during our talk earlier on?
Yes, and as I mentioned earlier, the South Korea and Japan, they are very important economic partners in the region. And they have, both of them have got the high-tech, the advanced technologies, and very advanced in terms of the strategic industries like the semiconductors and the displays and AI information and other things. So two countries needed to make a cooperation consistently, but the diplomatic and political the difficulties just got their barriers in terms of improving the economic cooperation. So in terms of the revitalizing the diplomatic relations between the two countries, mainly in terms of the kind of today's the summit, like a restarting point of the revitalizing the relations. Then the many experts expect that the countries revitalize the economic cooperation in the coming days and months. Specifically, recently the South government, the top aide, mentioned that the two governments will quickly restore the channel for economic cooperation at the ministerial level, about the very top level, like the finance, trade, science, and technology. It clearly shows what areas of the economic field the two countries are mainly focused on making their money and they're making profits in terms of the running their countries. So it's a really good sign of the signal that the two countries need to continue to make economic cooperation. It's very important, even for South Korea, in terms of the make economic profits.
Right, and also on the economic front, Min-jung, as our colleague, our senior presidential office correspondent Oh Soo-young mentioned in her coverage prior to leaving for Japan, President Yoon will be attending a corporate meeting with the industry heavyweights from here and over in Japan tomorrow. That would be Friday. We're looking at some big names there, right?
Right, Sunny. He will be attending a roundtable of key business figures on Friday, and he will be joined by the chiefs of Samsung, SK, LG, Hyundai, as well as representatives of small and medium-sized firms. The roundtable is co-hosted by the Federation of Korean Industries and the Japan Business Federation, and key business leaders from South Korea and Japan are set to discuss economic cooperation and common global issues. South Korea's FKI has previously said that it will work to bolster economic cooperation with Japan, as well as mutual investment and people-to-people exchanges. The presidential office has been saying that improving relations with Japan is not an option, but a necessity, as Japan is South Korea's key trade partner. Since 2019, around 20 trillion won, or around $15 billion worth of potential economic gains has been lost. And the presidential office insists the longer relations remain sour, the more South Korea will have to face those kinds of costs. However, it vowed to restore ministerial level cooperation channels between the two countries as soon as possible in the economic sector, and also strengthen strategic partnerships in new industries, technologies, EVs, and semiconductors.
Right, which of course are as important to South Korea as they are to neighboring Japan. Professor Min, let's move on now. What are your prospects with regard to perhaps a visit by Prime Minister Fumio Kishida to South Korea later this year?
Well, it's very important to have the Japanese Prime Minister in the Korean territory in the coming months, because it will be a kind of the real signal of restoring the shuttle diplomacy between the two countries. And as you know, the two countries have got the decision-making process that the top leaders make tough, difficult decisions, and then the technical procedures and administrative procedures will follow that kind of the decision. So in terms of the two countries' relations, the top leaders need to make the tough decisions, the difficult decisions continuously or again and again. So the shuttle diplomacy is very important in that aspect. And as you mentioned, it is expected that the Prime Minister Kishida will visit Seoul probably sometime this summer, probably between the June and the August, probably the late June or sometime July, because there will be the G7 summit in May in Tokyo. So probably the President Yoon may participate in the G7 summit, or because he could be invited by Joe Biden and the Kishida. So after that kind of already fixed the diplomatic events by the Japanese government. After that, the Japanese government will have some kind of time and space to visit the South Korea. So it is expected that the Kishida will visit the South Korea, the Seoul this summer, and it will be a really important signal or the sign that the two countries' shuttle diplomacy will be on the kind of the right track.
Right, the broader G7 summit over in Hiroshima this coming May, of course. Min-jung, despite hopes for some tangible improvements in bilateral ties following this latest summit between the two countries, we have lingering dark clouds, if I may, given the ongoing territorial dispute over Korea's Dokdo Island and, of course, Japan's planned discharge of radioactive water into the Pacific Ocean from the crippled Fukushima nuclear power plant, right?
Right. As you said, although the two countries are determined to make progress in mending relations, there are still some issues unresolved between the two countries. The dispute over Dokdo is one. Both sides have been in a heated dispute for decades over ownership of a group of islands called Dokdo in Korean. And South Korean's foreign ministry has continuously notified Japan that South Korea protests strongly against Japan's unfair claims about Dokdo. It's been saying that Japan's repeated claims about the island are not helpful for building a future-oriented relationship between the two countries. And there's also the issue surrounding the Sado gold mine. Japan has been pushing to have the Sado gold mine complex added to the UNESCO World Heritage List next year. And there's been a strong backlash from South Korea, as the gold mine was where at least 1,000 Koreans were subjected to forced labor during World War II. And another threat to improving Seoul-Tokyo ties is Japan's move to discharge wastewater from its Fukushima nuclear power plant. And Japan is reportedly preparing to release contaminated water into the sea as early as this spring. And South Korea has been against this move, as radioactive water, once discharged, is expected to affect Korean waters after about a year and could harm humans through exposure to food like seafood.
Right, and that, of course, also is a very sensitive issue here. Meanwhile, Professor Min, on the cultural front, industry insiders say that there is much to be gained from active cultural interactions between the two countries. Do you agree?
Yes, I agree, because the revitalizing relations between the two countries include the revitalizing the cultural ties of the human exchanges. And we saw the news reports about how quickly and how actively the two countries will revitalize the cultural ties. And as you know, the younger generations of the two countries have got lots of interest in each other. And the Japanese, the youngsters got very much the interest in the K-pop and the K-wave, and the Korean youngsters also got some interest in the Japanese the culture and other things. Think about how interesting to see the kind of the activity response to the slam dunk recently in the Korean territory.
Right, I'm happy you mentioned that. Actually, did you watch Slam Dunk, Professor Min?
No, not this time. But when I was a teenager, I saw the cartoons, and it's very
I know, my husband was so happy as well.
Yes,
right.
But anyway, the human exchange and the cultural exchange are very important for the improving the two countries' relations, and very important to maintain the economic ties between the two countries.
Right, of course. And Min-jung, President Yoon, staying with that, of course, President Yoon is set to meet with students at a local university in Japan, right?
Right. The president is also expected to give a lecture to Korean and Japanese students, university students at Keio University on Friday. The National Security Office said the lecture will be focused on encouraging the future leaders of Seoul and Tokyo and broadening consensus to expand exchanges and cooperation between the two countries. The president is expected to explain the so-called Future Youth Fund proposed by the South Korean government as part of the resolution measures for compensating forced labor victims. Now, the fund will likely be used to sponsor scholarships and other exchanges among younger generations. And the president's focus on future generations is in line with his aim of moving toward a future-oriented relationship with Japan. He's been saying that the two governments should work to help future generations play a pivotal role in order for the two countries to enter a new era of relations.
Right, hopefully. Professor Min, are there any other challenges, perhaps, that we have yet to cover that need to be tackled to ensure more productivity with regard to bilateral ties?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, the top priorities will go to the issues of the security and the economic cooperation between the two countries. So I think at this time, currently the Korean and Japanese delegations have kind of the small group, the meeting, and then the extended group meeting. So they will touch the various issues. So I think that the delegations just will focus on the
Right, I'm afraid we have just been interrupted. We need to cut live yet again to the venue over in Tokyo with regard to the summit between President Yoon and Prime Minister Kishida.
改めてユン・ソンニョル大統領および一行の皆様方のご訪日を歓迎申し上げます。
And I would like to thank President Yoon Suk-yeol for his visit to Tokyo, and we welcome him.
本格的な春の訪れを迎えたこの日に、私とユン大統領が将来に向けて日韓関係の新たな章を共に開く機会が訪れたこと、大変嬉しく思っております。
And we have cherry blossoms in Tokyo, and it seems like spring is already here. And at this beautiful period, it is great to receive President Yoon Suk-yeol and the delegation to open up a new chapter in the future.
This ICBM 級弾道ミサイルの発射は明白な挑発行為であり、到底看過はできません。こうした現下の厳しい戦略環境の下で、日韓、さらには日韓米の連携をさらに進めていくことについても議論をしたいと思います。
And today, we have agreed on a shuttle diplomacy, returning to shuttle diplomacy. And for better cooperation, we are going to cooperate in all fronts, including politics, economics, and I hope that we can talk about this during our extended talks. And this morning, North Korea had a provocation, launching a ballistic ICBM missile. And amidst such difficult and dire situation in the region, I hope we can discuss our opinions during our talks. Prime Minister Kishida, I would like to thank you for welcoming myself and my delegation. As the President of Republic of Korea, I am visiting Japan in 12 years, and we are having summit talks today. Today in Tokyo, together with Prime Minister Kishida, we are able to meet here today, and I hope that we can signal to the peoples of the two countries that our meeting today is opening up a new chapter of the two countries in the future. Republic of Korea shares with Japan the liberal democracy and human rights, and we are partners that cooperate in all fronts, including human rights and all global issues. Until now, the international relations are based on liberal democracy, and right now we are facing difficulties for this, and that is why the cooperation between our two countries is ever more important. This morning, before I departed for Tokyo, North Korea fired a long-range missile. And as we can see from here, I think this displays the North Korea's nuclear threat that is threatening not only the Northeast Asia, but also the world peace.
日増しに高度化している北による核やミサイルの脅威は東アジアのみならず国際社会の平和と安定にも大きな脅威となっています。
And our two countries, Korea and Japan, will closely cooperate and stand in solidarity to address wisely to such difficulties the world community is facing.
このような複合的な脅威や国際社会の難題に賢く対処していかなければなりません。
오늘 회담에서는
Today at our talks, I hope the stalled bilateral ties could be turned into a mutually beneficial relations.
これまで停滞してきた韓日関係を協力して共に生きて発展する関係へと転換できる有意義な議論が行われると信じております。
Prime Minister Kishida said, our shuttle diplomacy, I also welcome the shuttle diplomacy, returning to shuttle diplomacy. And from now on, I hope, and I will try and put all my efforts together with Prime Minister Kishida to normalize our relations between the two countries.
これからも岸田総理と緊密に意思疎通を図りながら両国の新たな時代に向けて共に協力を行ってまいりたいと思います。
それでは報道会お願いします。
Right, and that was live footage from Japan with the opening remarks by President Yoon Suk-yeol and his Japanese counterpart Fumio Kishida ahead of the actual summit talks between those two leaders. Of course, President Yoon Suk-yeol highlighted the shared values between South Korea and Japan with regard to democracy and human rights, while Prime Minister Fumio Kishida also touched upon the reality that spring was in the air over in Japan. That being said, Professor Min, what are your prospects with regard to the summit talks between the two leaders?
Well, the opening remarks just go well with the people's expectations about the summit, and both the leaders mentioned about the importance of the top agendas of today's meeting, like security, the threat by North Korea. Both the leaders mentioned about this morning's North Korea's this morning the ICBM the provocation, and they got kind of share the feelings about how grave it is for North Korea to make the repeated provocations around the Korean Peninsula. So the countries needed to make cooperation against North Korea's the military threats, and they also mentioned about improving their relations in terms of the political and economic and the cultural aspects. And the President Yoon also mentioned the possibility of the shuttle diplomacy in the coming months. And he will make the considered efforts to revitalize shuttle diplomacy. So we'll see the recurring shuttle diplomacy. Probably the two leaders will meet probably one time a quarter of the year, or 3 times, 4 times a year. So we'll see what the shuttle diplomacy means in terms of between the two leaders. And the President Yoon also mentioned that he is expected to have the new chapter in terms of the two countries' relations, and try to turn the two countries' relations into the mutually beneficial relations, so future-oriented relations. So that will be the good signal in terms of improving the two country relations and politically and economically and culturally. So I hope that there will be the better situations in terms of the two country relations.
Right, hopefully we'll keep our fingers crossed for that. As always, Professor Min, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts today. And Bin Jung here in the studio as well, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you.
Right, well, on that note, we end part 1 of our special live coverage of President Yoon Suk-yeol's agenda in neighboring Japan. In about half an hour, that would be 6 p.m. Korea Standard Time, my colleagues Yoon Jung-min and Kim Bo-kyung, respectively, will bring you the live broader part 2 of our special edition. Thank you for now.